The venison was tougher than boot leather. But Josephine Langford kept chewing with a determined expression on her dirt-smudged face, as the mountain man across the campfire watched her with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite her exhaustion. She had been traveling through the Nevada wilderness for 3 days straight, her wagon broken beyond repair 2 miles back, when she stumbled upon his camp just as the sun dipped behind the Sierra Nevada range in the autumn of 1878. Samuel Quinton had been tracking a wounded elk through the high country when he noticed the smoke from what should have been an empty stretch of wilderness. At 30 years old, he had spent the last decade of his life in these mountains, his broad shoulders and thick arms testament to years of hauling traps, splitting wood, and wrestling with nature itself. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather strip, and his sun-weathered face bore the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from a life lived entirely outdoors. When he found the young woman trying to start a fire with damp kindling, her hands shaking from cold and fear, something shifted in his chest. Josephine was 22, though the hardships of the past year had aged her in ways that did not show on her face. She had left St. Louis after her father died, leaving her with nothing but debts and the deed to a small plot of land outside Lovelock, Nevada, that her uncle had won in a card game and left to her father. The journey west had been brutal, and losing her traveling companions to cholera in Salt Lake City had forced her to continue alone, a decision that seemed increasingly foolish with each passing day. Now she sat by his fire, chewing the meat he had cooked for her, and trying to maintain some shred of dignity despite knowing she looked like something the wind had dragged across half the continent. The venison was indeed tough, nearly impossible to tear with her teeth, but she had learned not to complain about food, especially when it was freely given. What made it bearable, what actually made it surprisingly good, was whatever combination of herbs and salt he had rubbed into it before cooking. The flavors burst across her tongue, sage and something else she could not identify, making the difficult chewing almost worthwhile. Samuel watched her struggle with the meat and felt a smile tugging at his lips. She had spirit, this one. Most city women would have broken down crying by now, but she just kept chewing, her green eyes fixed on the fire as if daring it to mock her situation. He had been alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to want to protect someone, to feel responsible for another person's well-being. The feeling was both foreign and strangely comfortable, like finding an old coat that still fit perfectly. "The secret," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "is in the timing. Got to let it sit in the seasonings overnight before you cook it." Josephine looked up at him, still working on that same piece of meat, and nodded. She swallowed hard, the venison finally submitting to her determination. "It tastes wonderful," she said, and meant it. "I have not had anything this flavorful in weeks." He felt something warm spread through his chest at her words. "Got a whole elk hung up about a mile from here. Enough meat to last the winter if it is preserved right." "Do you live out here year-round?" she asked, reaching for another piece, despite knowing it would require the same effort as the first. "Built a cabin about 5 miles north. Been there 8 years now." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. "Do some trapping, some hunting. Trade furs in Lovelock twice a year." Her head snapped up. "Lovelock? That is where I am headed." Samuel studied her more carefully now, taking in the quality of her dress beneath the trail dust, the way she held herself despite her obvious exhaustion. "Got family there?" "No." She looked down at the meat in her hands. "I have land there, a small plot or so, I am told. I have never seen it. My uncle left it to my father, and my father left it to me. Land around Lovelock is good for ranching if you can get water to it." He shifted his weight, the firelight casting shadows across the planes of his face. "You planning to work it yourself?" Josephine heard the skepticism in his voice and straightened her spine. "I plan to do whatever is necessary. I did not come all this way to turn back now." There was steel in her voice, and Samuel found himself respecting it. Did not mean offense, just that it is hard country, especially for someone alone. "I know it is hard," she said quietly. "Everything has been hard for the past year, but hard is better than impossible, and staying in St. Louis was impossible." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them and the night sounds of the wilderness rising around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and Josephine tried not to flinch at the sound. She was determined not to show fear, not to this man who had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. "You can sleep by the fire," Samuel said eventually. "I will keep watch." "You need to sleep too," Josephine protested. "Sleep light out here. Any change in the night sounds wakes me up." He stood, and she was struck again by his sheer size. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the stars when he stood between her and the sky. "You are safe here, I give you my word on that." Josephine believed him. She was not sure why, given that she knew nothing about this man, except that he lived alone in the mountains, and could season venison better than anyone she had ever met. But something in his steady gaze and quiet confidence made her feel safer than she had in months. She wrapped herself in the blanket he offered, noting that it smelled of pine smoke and leather, and lay down near the fire. Salibi came faster than she expected, dragging her down into dreams of the journey behind her and the uncertain future ahead. She did not see Samuel watching over her through the night, his rifle across his knees, or the way his expression softened whenever his gaze fell on her sleeping form. Morning came with the smell of coffee, a luxury Josephine had run out of a week ago. She sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Samuel was crouched by the fire, pouring the dark liquid into 2 tin cups. He handed her one without a word, and she wrapped her cold fingers around it gratefully. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this. You did not have to help me. Could not leave you out here alone," he replied simply. "Your wagon, is it completely broken?" Josephine nodded. "The axle cracked. I tried to fix it, but I do not have the tools or the knowledge. I will take a look at it after breakfast. Might be able to rig something temporary to get you to Lovelock. I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking. I am offering." He met her eyes across the fire. "Drink your coffee before it gets cold." They ate a breakfast of Johnny cakes and the remainder of the venison from the night before, and then Samuel led her back along the trail to where she had abandoned her wagon. In the morning light it looked even more pathetic than she remembered, listing heavily to one side with the broken axle clearly visible. Her few possessions were still loaded in the back, covered with a canvas tarp to protect them from the elements. Samuel walked around the wagon slowly, examining it from every angle. Josephine watched him, noting the way his muscles moved beneath his buckskin shirt, the careful precision of his movements. He moved like someone completely comfortable in his own body, someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. "Axle is cracked clean through," he said finally, "but the wheels are still good. I can fashion a travois. Drag your belongings to my cabin. You can stay there while I go into Lovelock and arrange for proper transport for you." "I cannot impose on you like that," Josephine protested, even as relief flooded through her at the prospect of not having to face the wilderness alone. "You keep saying you cannot ask things of me, but I keep offering them anyway." He turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious. "I am not going to leave you stranded out here, and that is the end of it. Now help me unload this wagon so I can get to work." They worked together through the morning, Samuel constructing a sturdy travois from fallen timber, while Josephine organized her belongings. She did not have much, just clothes, a few books, her mother's china carefully wrapped in quilts, and the deed to her land in Lovelock. Everything she owned in the world fit on a travois pulled by one man, and the realization was both humbling and strangely liberating. By noon, they were ready to move. Samuel had rigged the travois so that he could pull it with a harness across his chest, leaving his hands free. Josephine offered to help pull, but he refused with a shake of his head. "Save your strength for walking," he said. "It is 5 miles to the cabin, and the terrain is rough." The journey took the rest of the day. Samuel set a steady pace that Josephine struggled to maintain, though she would have died before admitting it. Her feet ached in her worn boots, and her legs trembled with exhaustion by the time the cabin came into view in the late afternoon light. It was larger than she had expected, built solidly from logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. A small stream ran nearby, and there was a corral with 2 horses and a sturdy shed for supplies. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her amazement. "Took 3 years to get it the way I wanted it," Samuel said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. "Had help with the roof, a trapper friend who passed through. But most of it, yes." Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, with a large fireplace dominating one wall and a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. There was a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, and hooks on the walls for hanging tools and clothes. It was a bachelor's home, practical and efficient, but Josephine could see the care that had gone into every detail. "You can have the loft," Samuel said, setting down the travois harness. "I will sleep down here." "I cannot take your bed," Josephine protested. "The loft is warmer and you need proper rest." His tone made it clear the discussion was over. "I am going to hunt for a few hours, get us something for dinner, bar the door behind me and do not open it for anyone but me. I will knock 3 times, pause, then twice more. You remember that?" 3 times, pause, twice more, Josephine repeated. "But surely there is no danger here." "Probably not, but probably is not the same as certain." He picked up his rifle and checked the load. "I will be back before dark." After he left, Josephine explored the cabin more thoroughly. She found evidence of Samuel's solitary life in every corner. A single plate and cup in the cupboard, one chair worn smooth from use while the other looked barely touched, a razor and soap by the wash basin. On one shelf she found a small collection of books, their spines cracked from repeated reading. Adventure stories mostly, and one volume of poetry that surprised her. She climbed the ladder to the loft and found a bed with a thick feather mattress and wool blankets. The space was small but cozy, with a window that looked out over the stream. This was where Samuel had slept for years, she realized, and felt strangely honored that he would give it up for her without hesitation. By the time he returned, carrying 2 rabbits already skinned and cleaned, Josephine had organized her belongings in one corner of the loft and attempted to make herself presentable with the wash basin and a cloth. She had changed into her best dress, a deep blue calico that brought out her eyes. Though she told herself she was not trying to impress anyone, Samuel paused when he saw her, something flickering across his face too quickly for her to identify. "You look rested," he said finally. "I feel almost human again," she admitted. "Can I help with dinner? Can you cook?" "My mother taught me before she died. I am not fancy, but I can make food edible." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable. "Then yes, you can help. I am tired of my own cooking." They worked together in the small kitchen area, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Josephine prepared the rabbits with herbs from Samuel's surprisingly well-stocked supply while he made biscuits, his large hands working the dough with unexpected delicacy. They talked as they cooked, the conversation flowing more naturally than it had the night before. "How did you end up out here?" Josephine asked, cutting the rabbit into pieces. "Came west after the war," Samuel said. "Could not settle back into regular life after everything I had seen. Kept moving until I found a place remote enough that the nightmares did not follow." "I am sorry," she said quietly. "My father fought too. He never talked about it, but I could see it in his eyes sometimes. Smart man, keeping it to himself. No point burdening others with those memories." He shaped the last biscuit and set it in the pan. "What about you? What made you decide to come west alone?" Josephine told him about her father's death, about the debts he had left behind, and the landlord who had made it clear he expected payment in forms she would never provide. She told him about selling everything of value except her mother's china, about the long journey west and the companions she had lost along the way. Samuel listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly serious. "You are braver than most men I have known," he said when she finished. "I am not brave. I was desperate. Same thing sometimes." Dinner was ready as the sun set, and they sat at the small table to eat. The rabbit was tender and flavorful, and the biscuits were light and fluffy. They ate in comfortable silence for a while before Samuel spoke again. "I will ride to Lovelock tomorrow. Find out about your land, arrange for someone to take you there. Should be back in 2 days. Will you be safe traveling alone?" Josephine asked, then felt foolish. This man had survived alone in the wilderness for years. But Samuel did not laugh at her concern. "I know every trail between here and town. I will be fine." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "You will be safe here. There is food enough for a week, and both horses if you need them. But you should stay inside, keep the door barred." "I am not afraid to be alone," she said, though her heart quickened at the thought of spending 2 days in the cabin without him. Not about fear, about being practical. He met her eyes. "You have come too far to take unnecessary risks now." That night, lying in the loft and listening to Samuel moving around below, Josephine found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been alone and terrified, her future uncertain, and her resources nearly exhausted. Now she was in a mountain cabin with a man she barely knew, feeling safer and more cared for than she had in years. It made no sense, and yet it felt more right than anything had in a long time. Below, Samuel lay on his bedroll by the fire and stared at the ceiling. He could hear Josephine shifting in the loft above him, and the sound made him acutely aware of how empty his cabin had always felt before. In just one day, she had brought life to this place, filling the silence with conversation and laughter and the simple comfort of another presence. The thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its previous emptiness, created an ache in his chest that he did not want to examine too closely. He left at dawn before Josephine was fully awake. She heard him moving around, heard the horses in the corral, and by the time she climbed down the ladder, he was gone. A note on the table said simply, "Back soon, stay safe." She held the scrap of paper for a long moment, tracing the careful letters with one finger before tucking it into her pocket. The first day alone passed slowly. Josephine kept herself busy cleaning the cabin, organizing the supplies, and reading from Samuel's collection of books. She found herself drawn to the poetry volume, surprised by the worn pages and the careful notes in the margins. The handwriting was the same as on the note, strong and deliberate, and she tried to imagine this large, rough mountain man reading poetry by firelight. The second day was harder. The cabin felt too quiet, and every sound from outside made her jump. She tried to cook something for Samuel's return, mixing together ingredients she found in the stores to make a stew. It was not until she was adding the last of the seasonings that she realized she was using the same herbs he had used on the venison, trying to recreate that perfect combination of flavors. Samuel returned as the sun was setting on the second day, riding hard up the trail to the cabin. Josephine heard the hoofbeats and rushed to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of him. He looked tired but unharmed, and when he saw her waiting, his face broke into a smile that made her heart skip. "You are back," she said, hating how breathless she sounded. "Said I would be." He dismounted and began unsaddling his horse. "I have news about your land." They waited until he had cared for the horses and come inside to talk. Samuel accepted a bowl of the stew she had made, and Josephine watched nervously as he took the first bite. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked up at her with an expression she could not quite read. "This is good," he said. "Really good. You used my seasoning blend. I hope you do not mind. I wanted to have dinner ready when you returned." "Mind? I am impressed you figured it out." He took another bite. Most people cannot get the proportions right. They ate together, and then Samuel told her what he had learned in Lovelock. Her land was real 40 acres about 10 miles from town with a small stream running through it. The previous owner, her uncle, had started to build a house before he died, but it was far from complete. The land had value, particularly if she could establish a water source for cattle, but working it alone would be nearly impossible. "The land office clerk suggested you might want to sell," Samuel said carefully. "Said there are several ranchers who would pay fair price for property with water access." Josephine set down her spoon. "And then what? Use the money to go back east? Return to St. Louis with nothing? You could stay in Lovelock, use the money to start over. Open a business, maybe. You can cook, and the town needs a good restaurant." "Is that what you think I should do?" she asked, and something in her voice made him meet her eyes. "I think you should do whatever will make you happy," Samuel said quietly. "But I also think you did not come all this way just to give up on the dream that brought you here. What if the dream was foolish? What if I am not strong enough to make it work?" He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, but the warmth of his rough palm against her skin sent a shock through her entire body. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. You survived things that would have broken most folks. If you want to make that land work, you will find a way. Even if I need help," she asked softly. "Everyone needs help sometimes. That is not weakness. That is just being human." They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching across the table, something unspoken building in the air between them. Finally, Samuel pulled back, clearing his throat. "I told the land office you would come by within the week to see the property. If you want, I can take you there. Show you what you are working with before you make any decisions." "I would like that," Josephine said. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything you have done for me." "You do not need to keep thanking me," he said, but his voice was warm. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt dangerously comfortable. They worked together during the day, Samuel teaching Josephine about the wilderness and the skills she would need to survive in this harsh country. He showed her how to read animal tracks, how to find water, how to set snares for small game. She proved to be a quick learner, absorbing everything he taught her with fierce determination. In the evenings, they cooked together, their movements in the small kitchen space becoming increasingly synchronized. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Josephine told him about her mother's garden in St. Louis, about the books she loved to read and the places she had dreamed of seeing. Samuel talked about his years in the mountains, about the brutal winters and the quiet beauty of the land, about the peace he had found in solitude. But beneath the comfortable domesticity, tension was building. Josephine found herself increasingly aware of Samuel's presence, the way his muscles moved when he worked, the sound of his laugh, the gentle way he spoke to the horses. Samuel caught himself watching her when he should have been focused on other things, noticing the way firelight caught in her hair and the graceful movements of her hands. On the 5th day, they rode out to see her land. It was a beautiful property, nestled in a valley with mountains rising on 3 sides and a clear stream running through the center. The partially built house was more complete than Josephine had dared to hope, with 4 walls and a roof frame already in place. It would take work to finish, but it was possible. They walked the property together, Samuel pointing out the best locations for a garden, where to build a corral, how to divert water for irrigation. With every suggestion, Josephine could see the vision more clearly, could imagine a life built on this land. But she could also see the enormous amount of work it would require, work that she could not possibly do alone. "It is overwhelming," she admitted as they stood by the stream, watching the water flow past. "Most worthwhile things are," Samuel said. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "But you break big jobs into small pieces, tackle one thing at a time. Before you know it, impossible becomes possible." Josephine turned to look at him, struck suddenly by how much she had come to depend on his presence in just a few short days. "What if I asked you to help me?" "I told you I will help however I can." "No, I mean really help. Not just advice but actual work. I could pay you once I get the land productive. Or I could cook and clean in exchange for your labor." "Or Josephine," he interrupted gently. "You do not have to bargain with me." "Then what do I have to do?" she asked, frustration and something else creeping into her voice. "You have been so kind, so generous, but I do not understand why. What do you want from me?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was struggling with something. Finally he said, "I want to see you succeed. I want to know that you are safe and happy." "Is that so hard to believe?" "Yes," she said honestly. "In my experience, no one does something for nothing." "Then your experience has been with the wrong people." He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "I am not asking for anything from you except the chance to help. If that makes me foolish, so be it." They rode back to the cabin in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with unspoken words and feelings neither of them was ready to name. That night, as Josephine lay in the loft and listened to the familiar sounds of Samuel preparing for sleep below, she realized with startling clarity that she did not want to leave this cabin. More than that, she did not want to leave him. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with a strange sort of peace. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she had found a place where she belonged, and that place had nothing to do with land or property, and everything to do with the quiet, strong man who had welcomed her into his home and his life. Below, Samuel lay awake and faced the truth he had been avoiding for days. He was falling in love with Josephine Langford, had been falling since the moment he saw her trying to start a fire with damp kindling. The thought of her leaving, of going to her land, and starting a life that did not include him, was becoming unbearable. But what could he offer her? A rough mountain man with more scars than prospects who had spent the last decade running from his past. She deserved better than him, deserved someone who could give her a real life in town with neighbors and social events, and all the things proper young ladies were supposed to want. But even as he thought it, he knew it was not true. Josephine was not like other women he had known. She had crossed half the continent alone, had faced hardship and danger without breaking. She was stronger than she knew, and brave enough to build a life in this harsh country if she chose to. The question was whether that life could somehow include him. The next morning, Samuel made a decision. "I am going to help you finish that house," he announced over breakfast. Josephine looked up from her coffee, surprise evident on her face. "Samuel, I cannot ask you to do that." "Good thing you are not asking. I am offering." He set down his cup with more force than necessary. "It will take a few weeks, maybe a month if we work hard, but we can get it livable before the first snow." "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. "Because I love you," he thought but could not say. "Because the thought of you leaving is tearing me apart. Because I want to make sure you have a safe place to live even if it is not with me. Because it is the right thing to do," he said instead. "And because I think you have had enough people in your life who did not help when they should have." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "I do not know how to thank you." "Then do not try. Just say yes." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. Please help me." They began work the next day. Samuel moved some of his tools and supplies to the property, and they established a routine of riding out each morning and working until dark. Josephine proved to be surprisingly skilled with a hammer and saw, and Samuel found himself impressed by her determination to learn every aspect of the construction. The work was hard but satisfying. Together they completed the roof, built a proper door and window frames, and constructed a stone fireplace using rocks from the stream. They worked side by side in the autumn sunshine, their conversations flowing easily as they planned and built and dreamed. It was during the third week of work that everything changed. They had been working on the fireplace all day, and Josephine had insisted on cooking dinner to thank Samuel for his help. She had brought supplies from the cabin and prepared a meal while he finished securing the last of the stones. The main course was venison steaks from a deer Samuel had taken the day before. seasoned with the special blend that had become their shared secret. They sat on the floor of the half-finished house, eating off tin plates and watching the sun set through the window opening. The venison was tough, overcooked because Josephine had been distracted by other preparations. But the seasoning was perfect, making each difficult bite worth the effort. Samuel was chewing a particularly stubborn piece, working it with his jaw while trying not to show how much effort it required when Josephine started laughing. It began as a small giggle, then grew into full, genuine laughter that made her eyes water and her shoulders shake. "I am sorry," she gasped between laughs. "You are being so polite about it, but this venison is absolutely terrible. I cooked it far too long." Samuel, still chewing the same piece, found himself laughing too. It felt good, natural, like something he had been holding back for years finally breaking free. He swallowed the venison with effort and said, "The meat is tough, I will grant you that." "Tough as boot leather," Josephine agreed, still smiling. "But the seasoning," Samuel continued, his eyes locked on hers, "the seasoning is perfect, just like always." Something shifted in the air between them. The laughter faded, replaced by an awareness that had been building for weeks. Samuel set down his plate, his heart hammering in his chest as words he had not planned to say pushed their way to the surface. "Josephine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," she breathed. He was still chewing another piece of the tough venison, still working his jaw around the stubborn meat, when the words burst out of him. "Will you marry me?" Josephine froze, her eyes going wide. "What?" Samuel swallowed hard, the venison finally going down. "I know I should have waited for a better moment. I know I should have planned this out, made it romantic somehow. But I cannot keep these feelings inside anymore. I love you, Josephine. I have loved you since I found you trying to start that fire with damp kindling. I love your strength and your courage and the way you laugh. I love how you do not give up, even when things are hard. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to face anything alone again." Tears were streaming down Josephine's face now, but she was smiling. "You proposed to me while chewing tough venison? I know. I am sorry. That was not—" "It is perfect," she interrupted, laughing through her tears. "It is absolutely perfect because it is so perfectly us. Of course you would propose in the middle of dinner, in a half-finished house, with no planning or preparation. That is exactly who you are, Samuel Quinton, honest and real and completely wonderful." "Is that a yes?" he asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Yes," she said, and then louder. "Yes, yes, I will marry you. I love you too. I have been trying not to admit it to myself because it seemed too fast, too improbable. But I love you so much it scares me." Samuel moved then, crossing the small space between them in one motion and pulling her into his arms. He kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he had been holding back, and Josephine kissed him back with equal fervor. They broke apart only when breathing became necessary, their foreheads resting together as they tried to process what had just happened. "I do not have a ring," Samuel said. "I do not have much of anything to offer you except myself and a cabin in the mountains." "That is more than enough," Josephine assured him. "That is everything." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, their words tumbling over each other in their excitement. They would finish Josephine's house and rent it out to provide income. They would live in Samuel's cabin, at least for now, and work together on expanding it. Samuel would continue his trapping and hunting, and Josephine would establish a garden and perhaps raise chickens. They would build a life together, one day at a time, facing whatever challenges came with the confidence of two people who had already survived so much. "When should we marry?" Josephine asked as they rode back to the cabin that night, the stars brilliant overhead. "As soon as possible," Samuel said immediately. "I have waited 30 years to find someone like you. I do not want to wait any longer than necessary to make you my wife." "There is a circuit preacher who comes through Lovelock once a month," Josephine said. "We could inquire when he will be back." "We will ride to town tomorrow," Samuel decided. "Get the information. Buy you a proper ring, let everyone know we are to be married." Josephine smiled in the darkness, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "I never imagined when I set out from St. Louis that I would end up here with you. If someone had told me I would fall in love with a mountain man who proposed while eating tough venison, I would have thought they were mad. And now?" Samuel asked. "Now I think it is the most sensible thing that has ever happened to me," she said simply. They rode into Lovelock the next morning, causing quite a stir among the small town's residents. Samuel was known there but rarely seen except during his twice-yearly trips to trade furs. The sight of him riding in with a pretty young woman sparked immediate gossip and speculation. The circuit preacher was not due back for 2 weeks, but they left their names with the local minister who sometimes performed weddings in emergencies. They visited the general store, where Samuel purchased a simple gold band that fit Josephine's finger perfectly. She insisted he did not need to spend the money, but the look of pride on his face when he slipped the ring on her hand made her fall in love with him all over again. News of their engagement spread through Lovelock like wildfire. Several townspeople expressed surprise that the hermit mountain man was getting married, but those who spoke to the couple could see the genuine affection between them. The general store owner's wife, a kind woman named Martha, offered to help Josephine prepare for the wedding and gave her advice on being married to a man of the mountains. "You will be lonely sometimes," Martha warned. "The winters are long and isolating. Make sure you have books and projects to keep yourself occupied." "I do not think I will be lonely," Josephine said, watching Samuel through the store window as he talked with some trappers about the coming winter. "Not with him." Martha followed her gaze and smiled. "You are lucky, you know. Samuel Quinton is one of the good ones. Keeps to himself mostly, but he has helped folks out more than once when they needed it. You could do much worse." "I know how lucky I am," Josephine said softly. They spent 2 more weeks finishing the house, working with renewed energy and purpose. Every nail driven, every board fitted into place, felt like they were building not just a structure but a foundation for their future together. They talked as they worked, learning more about each other with each passing day. Samuel told her about his childhood in Ohio, about losing his mother to fever and his father to the war. He talked about the battles he had fought and the friends he had lost, opening up about his past in ways he never had with anyone. Josephine listened without judgment, understanding now why he had sought solace in the remote mountains. Josephine told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher before her mother got sick, about the years she spent caring for her parents instead of building a life of her own. She talked about the guilt she felt at sometimes resenting the sacrifices she had made, and the grief that had threatened to drown her after her father died. "You should not feel guilty about that," Samuel said gently. "You gave up your dreams to care for them. It is natural to feel conflicted about it." "My mother would have wanted me to live my own life," Josephine said. "She told me as much before she died. But I could not leave my father alone. And now you get to live that life," Samuel pointed out. "Maybe not the way you imagined when you were young, but your own life nonetheless." "A better life than I imagined," Josephine corrected, reaching over to squeeze his hand. The house was completed 3 days before the wedding. They stood together in the doorway looking at what they had accomplished. It was simple but solid, a one-room structure with a sleeping loft, a good fireplace, and windows that let in plenty of light. The furniture was basic, built by Samuel from local wood, but it was functional and sturdy. "Someone will be happy here," Josephine said. "We could be happy here," Samuel offered, "if you would rather live on your own land than in my cabin." Josephine considered it, then shook her head. "Your cabin feels like home already. This place feels like an accomplishment, something we built together, but home is where you have been living, where we will build our life together." Samuel pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We can decide later. We have all the time in the world now." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning in 1878, in the small church in Lovelock, Nevada. Josephine wore her best dress, the deep blue calico she had worn that first night in Samuel's cabin, and carried a bouquet of late-season wildflowers that Samuel had gathered for her. Samuel wore new clothes purchased from the general store, though he looked uncomfortable in the stiff fabric and kept tugging at his collar. Martha and her husband served as witnesses, along with a few other townspeople who had befriended the couple during their visits to Lovelock. The ceremony was simple and brief, the circuit preacher reading the traditional vows in a voice that carried through the small space. When Samuel was told he could kiss his bride, he did so with a gentleness that made several of the women in attendance sigh. Josephine kissed him back, pouring all her love and hope and joy into that moment, knowing that whatever challenges they faced in the future, they would face them together. The town held a small celebration at the general store, with food and music and well wishes from the community. Samuel accepted the congratulations with his usual quiet grace, while Josephine charmed everyone with her warm smile and genuine gratitude for their kindness. By the time they left Lovelock that afternoon, riding toward the cabin that was now their shared home, they had been fully accepted by the community as a legitimate couple with a future in the territory. The ride to the cabin felt different now, charged with anticipation and a nervous energy that neither of them had expected. They were married, bound together by law and faith in their own promises. The reality of it was both thrilling and slightly terrifying. As they approached the cabin, Samuel reined in his horse suddenly. "Wait here," he said, and before Josephine could ask why, he had dismounted and was striding toward the cabin door. She watched in confusion as he went inside, then emerged a moment later with a satisfied expression. He walked back to her horse and reached up, lifting her down from the saddle with easy strength. Then, to her complete surprise, he swept her up into his arms. "Samuel, what are you doing?" she laughed. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said simply. "It is tradition, is it not?" "I did not think you cared about traditions. I care about this one." He started walking toward the cabin, Josephine secure in his arms. "I want to do this right. Want you to know that this is your home now, not just a place you are staying." Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck, her eyes suddenly misty. "You are the most wonderful man I have ever known." "I am just a man who loves you," Samuel said, and carried her through the door into their new life together. That night they consummated their marriage in the loft where Josephine had slept alone for weeks. Samuel was gentle and patient, taking his time despite his obvious desire, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Josephine had been nervous, her knowledge of marital relations limited to vague warnings from older women, but Samuel made everything feel natural and right. Afterward they lay tangled together under the wool blankets, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of the fire below. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked, his voice rumbling through his chest where Josephine's head rested. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "Are you?" "I did not think I could feel this way again," he admitted. "After the war, after everything, I thought I was done with happiness. I thought I would just exist out here until I died. But then you showed up, struggling with that damp kindling, looking like you would fight the whole world before you would give up, and suddenly I wanted to live again." Josephine raised herself up on one elbow to look at him, her heart aching with love. "Then we saved each other," she said. "Because I was just existing too, just surviving. You showed me what it means to really live." They made love again, slower this time, exploring each other with growing confidence. When they finally fell asleep, wrapped in each other's arms, both felt a peace they had not known in years. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Samuel was not used to sharing his space, and Josephine had to learn the rhythms of his solitary life. They had small arguments about silly things, like how to organize the storage shed or whether the horses needed more grain. But they also learned how to compromise, how to talk through disagreements, how to apologize when they were wrong. Winter came early that year, snow falling in late November and not stopping until spring. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, dependent entirely on each other for company and entertainment. Josephine read aloud from Samuel's books while he carved new tools and repaired equipment. They cooked elaborate meals just for something to do, experimenting with different seasonings and techniques. On particularly cold nights, they would lie in the loft and talk for hours, sharing dreams and fears and memories. Samuel told her about his plans to expand their trapping operation, maybe take on an apprentice to help with the work. Josephine talked about wanting to start a school in Lovelock, teaching the children who grew up in this harsh country. They made plans for the spring, for the garden Josephine wanted to plant and the new corral Samuel needed to build. It was during one of these conversations in late January that Josephine told Samuel she thought she might be pregnant. He went very still, his hand freezing where it had been stroking her hair. "Are you sure?" he asked carefully. "Not completely. But I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling ill in the mornings." She turned to look at him, trying to read his expression in the dim firelight. "Are you angry? Angry?" Samuel repeated, as if the word made no sense. "Why would I be angry? It is sooner than we planned. We talked about waiting a year, getting established first." Samuel pulled her closer, his hand moving to rest on her still, flat stomach. "Plans change. Life happens. And if you are carrying our child, then I am the happiest man in the mountains." Tears filled Josephine's eyes. "You mean that?" "I mean it with everything I am," he said fiercely. "You and this baby, you are my whole world now. Nothing else matters." They confirmed the pregnancy a few weeks later when the weather cleared enough for them to ride to Lovelock. The doctor, an elderly man who had practiced medicine for 40 years, examined Josephine and pronounced her healthy and approximately 3 months along. The baby would come in early summer, he estimated, probably June or July. Samuel was overwhelmed with protective instincts, insisting that Josephine rest more and work less. She tolerated his hovering for about a week before putting her foot down. "I am pregnant, not dying," she said firmly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can still chop vegetables and feed the horses, but you should be resting, taking care of yourself. I am taking care of myself by staying active and useful. If you try to make me sit still for the next 4 months, I will lose my mind." She softened her tone, seeing the genuine worry in his eyes. "I know you are scared. I am scared too. But we cannot let fear control our lives." Samuel pulled her into his arms, careful of her growing belly. "I could not bear it if something happened to you." "Nothing is going to happen to me," she assured him. "I am strong and I have you to take care of me. We are going to be fine." As winter gave way to spring, Josephine's pregnancy progressed without complication. Her belly grew round and prominent, and Samuel found himself fascinated by the changes in her body. He would sit for hours with his hand on her stomach, feeling their baby kick and move, his face full of wonder. They prepared for the baby's arrival with the same careful planning they brought to everything. Samuel built a cradle from smooth, sanded wood and lined it with soft furs. Josephine sewed tiny clothes from fabric she had ordered from the general store, her stitches careful and precise. They turned one corner of the loft into a nursery of sorts, organizing everything they thought they might need. Martha and some of the other women from Lovelock came to visit in late May, bringing gifts and advice for the new parents. They taught Josephine about birthing and nursing, answering her questions with the frank honesty of women who had been through it themselves. Samuel was banished from the cabin during these discussions, but he did not mind. He used the time to hunt and fish, stocking their supplies for the days after the baby came when he would need to focus on Josephine and their child. Josephine went into labor on a hot June afternoon, exactly a year after she had stumbled into Samuel's camp with damp kindling and desperate hope. The contractions started slowly, almost gently, and she thought at first they were just the false pains the doctor had warned her about. But they grew stronger and closer together, and by evening there was no doubt what was happening. Samuel rode to Lovelock through the fading light, his horse lathered with sweat by the time he reached town. He pounded on the doctor's door, his usual calm composure shattered by fear and anticipation. The doctor, bless him, did not waste time. He grabbed his bag and his horse and they raced back to the cabin together. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Samuel held Josephine's hand, offering her water and encouragement even as his heart felt like it might burst from worry. The doctor worked with calm efficiency, monitoring both mother and baby, offering quiet reassurance when the contractions grew particularly intense. Just after dawn, with the morning light streaming through the window, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin and made both parents laugh through their tears. The doctor cleaned him up and laid him on Josephine's chest, and Samuel leaned in close, the three of them forming a tight circle of exhausted joy. "He is perfect," Samuel whispered, touching one tiny fist with a finger that looked enormous in comparison. "He has your eyes," Josephine said, though the baby's eyes were still unfocused and would not settle into their final color for weeks yet. "And your stubborn expression," Samuel countered, making her laugh weakly. They named him Thomas Samuel Quinton after Josephine's father and his new papa. Thomas was a good baby, sleeping and eating on a predictable schedule that allowed his parents to adjust to their new roles without complete exhaustion. Samuel proved to be a surprisingly natural father, changing diapers and walking the floor during fussy periods with patient determination. Josephine recovered quickly from the birth, her natural resilience serving her well. Within a few weeks she was back to her normal routines, though now with a baby strapped her back or sleeping in his cradle nearby. She sang to Thomas as she worked, old songs her mother had taught her mixed with new ones she made up on the spot. The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. They watched him grow from a tiny, helpless infant into a curious, active baby. He learned to smile, to laugh, to roll over, and eventually to crawl. Samuel built a small fence around the hearth to keep Thomas safe when he started exploring, and Josephine sewed patches onto the knees of his little trousers when he wore them through from crawling on the rough cabin floors. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Samuel trapped and hunted, providing for his family with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. Josephine managed the household, tended her garden, and cared for Thomas with patient love. They worked as a team, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the victories, no matter how small. On their second wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Josephine by taking her and Thomas to see her property. The house they had built together stood solid and weathered, occupied now by a young couple who were renting it while they saved money to buy their own land. The rent provided a small but steady income that gave Josephine a sense of independence she treasured. "I have been thinking," Samuel said as they stood by the stream, Thomas playing in the grass at their feet, "maybe we should build another house. A bigger one, with separate rooms for the children." "Children?" Josephine repeated, smiling. "How many are you planning on?" "However many we are blessed with," he said simply. "Thomas should have brothers and sisters, and this cabin is already feeling cramped with just 3 of us." "I think that is a wonderful idea," Josephine said, leaning against his shoulder. Though maybe we should wait until Thomas is walking before we add another baby to the mix." Samuel laughed, a sound that still made her heart skip even after 2 years of marriage. "Fair enough, we have time." They did build that house, starting when Thomas was 2 and completing it by his 3rd birthday. It was larger than either the cabin or Josephine's rental property, with 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. They moved in during the spring of 1881, and Josephine felt a sense of completion, as if all the pieces of her life had finally fallen into their proper places. By the time Thomas was 4, he had a little sister named Grace Elizabeth, who had her mother's green eyes and her father's serious temperament. Samuel doted on his daughter with the same fierce protectiveness he showed Josephine, and Thomas proved to be a gentle and caring big brother. Life was not without its challenges. There were hard winters when game was scarce and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries, the constant small dangers of frontier life. But through it all, Samuel and Josephine faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. They became fixtures in the Lovelock community, respected for their hard work and integrity. Samuel served occasionally as a guide for newcomers to the territory, using his knowledge of the land to help others settle safely. Josephine started the school she had dreamed of, teaching the children of Lovelock 3 days a week during the winter months, when farming and ranching work was slow. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was peaceful, Samuel and Josephine would sit together on their porch and reflect on how far they had come. From that first meeting over a failing campfire to this life they had built together, filled with love and laughter and purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked one such evening. "Marrying me, I mean. You could have had an easier life in town, married to a shopkeeper or a banker." Josephine turned to look at him, this strong, gentle man who had given her everything she never knew she needed. "Not for one single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Samuel Quinton. You and this life we have built together." "Even though I proposed while chewing tough venison?" he asked with a smile. "Especially because you proposed while chewing tough venison," she said, laughing. "It was perfectly imperfect, just like us." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Inside, their children slept safely, unaware of how fortunate they were to be born into a home filled with love and security. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new moments to treasure. But tonight, everything was perfect. Years continued to pass in this way, marked by the growth of their children and the deepening of their bond. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Grace proved to have her mother's quick mind and love of learning, devouring every book she could get her hands on. And when Thomas was 8 and Grace was 4, they were joined by a second son, James William, who inherited the best traits of both parents and added his own unique personality to the family dynamic. Samuel expanded his business, taking on 2 apprentice trappers and teaching them the skills he had spent years perfecting. The additional income allowed them to make improvements to their property, adding a barn and a second corral, expanding the garden, and even installing a hand pump for the well that made Josephine's daily tasks significantly easier. Josephine's school grew as well, eventually moving into a dedicated building in Lovelock that the town built specifically for that purpose. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to children ranging from age 5 to 15, earning a small salary that she saved carefully for the children's future. They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary with a party at their house, inviting half the town to join them. Martha, now elderly but still sharp as a tack, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. 10 years ago, Martha said, raising her glass, a hermit mountain man and a lost girl from St. Louis proved that love can bloom anywhere, even over tough venison and imperfect seasonings. They have built something beautiful here, not just a home but a family, not just a marriage but a partnership. Here is to Samuel and Josephine, and to many more years of happiness together. Everyone cheered and drank, and Samuel pulled Josephine close, kissing her soundly despite the audience. Their children groaned in embarrassment, but Josephine just laughed and kissed him back. After 10 years, the passion between them had not dimmed, but had instead transformed into something deeper and more enduring. As the party wound down and their guests departed, Samuel and Josephine stood on their porch watching the last wagon disappear down the trail. Inside, the children were supposed to be getting ready for bed, though the sounds of laughter and running feet suggested they were too excited to settle down. "It has been a good life," Samuel said quietly. "The best life," Josephine agreed. "And it all started because my wagon broke and you were kind enough to help a stranger." Not just kindness, Samuel corrected. Even then, I think I knew you were going to change everything. Was it when you saw me struggling with the damp kindling? It was when you refused to give up on it, he said. Even though it was obviously not going to work, you kept trying. That is when I knew you were special. Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and pine and home. We should go inside. The children need to sleep, and so do we. In a minute, Samuel said, wrapping his arm around her waist. Let me hold my wife a little longer and be grateful for everything we have. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. Behind them, their house glowed with lamplight and love. Before them, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to their story and guardians of their future. Years later, when Thomas was grown and married with children of his own, he asked his mother about the early days of her relationship with his father. They were sitting in the kitchen of the house Samuel had built, now expanded and improved, but still fundamentally the same. Grace was there too, visiting from Virginia City, where she taught at a larger school, and James was out in the barn helping Samuel with some repairs. How did you know Papa was the right man? Thomas asked. How did you know you would not regret marrying him? Josephine smiled, her hands stilling on the bread dough she was kneading. She was in her 50s now, her hair threaded with silver and her face lined with years of laughter and sun. But her eyes were as bright as ever, still holding that determined spark that had first caught Samuel's attention. I did not know, she said honestly, not with absolute certainty. But I knew that he was kind when kindness was rare. I knew that he saw me as strong when I felt weak. I knew that he made me want to be brave even when I was terrified. And I knew that tough venison tasted perfect when he seasoned it, and that seemed as good a foundation for a marriage as anything else. Grace laughed. Mama, you cannot be serious. Papa proposed over bad cooking? The cooking was not bad, Josephine protested. The meat was just tough. But the seasoning was perfect, just like always. And yes, your father proposed right then, mid-chew, because he has never been one to wait for the perfect moment. He just acts when something feels right. That sounds like Papa, Thomas agreed. Do you ever wish he had been more romantic about it? Waited for moonlight or roses or something traditional? Josephine considered the question seriously before answering. No, she said finally. Because the proposal was perfectly us. We are not fancy people with fancy ways. We are practical and honest and real. That moment with its imperfect timing and tough venison, that was more romantic than any staged proposal could have been. It was genuine. She paused, looking out the window to where Samuel was emerging from the barn, James at his side. Even in his 50s, Samuel was still strong and capable, his hair now more silver than dark, but his frame still solid with muscle. He looked toward the house and saw her watching, and his face broke into a smile that made her heart flutter just like it had 30 years ago. Your father gave me everything, Josephine said softly. A home, a family, a purpose. But more than that, he gave me himself, his complete and total self, with all his strengths and weaknesses, his past and his future. He held nothing back, and neither did I. That is what love is, children. Not perfect moments and grand gestures, but two people choosing each other every single day, through tough times and easy times, through tough venison and perfect seasoning. She turned back to her bread, kneading with practiced efficiency. Now, are you two going to help me with dinner? Or are you going to sit there asking philosophical questions while your father and brother do all the work? The children laughed and got up to help, and soon the kitchen was full of movement and conversation and love. Samuel came in a few minutes later, hanging his hat by the door and washing up at the basin. He came up behind Josephine and kissed the back of her neck, making her giggle like a young girl. What is for dinner? He asked. Venison stew, she said, with plenty of your special seasoning blend. Is the meat tough? He teased. Does it matter if the seasoning is perfect? He turned her around and kissed her properly, ignoring the groans from their adult children. Not one bit, he said against her lips. Not one bit. That evening, as 3 generations of Quintons gathered around the expanded dining table, passing bowls of food and sharing stories and laughter, Josephine looked around at everything she had built from nothing but determination and love. Her children were healthy and happy. Her grandchildren were growing up with opportunities she had only dreamed of, and her husband still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. The journey from St. Louis to this moment had been long and difficult, filled with heartbreak and hardship, but every step had been worth it to arrive here, in this house filled with love, with this family she had helped create, with this man who had proposed to her mid-chew over tough venison and perfect seasoning. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the grandchildren were tucked into bed, and the adult children had retired to their old rooms. Samuel and Josephine walked out to the porch one more time. It was their nightly ritual, this quiet time together at the end of the day, and they had maintained it through 30 years of marriage. "Do you remember the first time we stood out here?" Samuel asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Of course. It was the night we moved into this house. Grace was just a baby, and Thomas was so excited to have his own room. I told you then that we would build a good life here. You did, and we have." Josephine leaned against him, fitting perfectly into his side the way she always had. "We have built a wonderful life." They stood in comfortable lessons, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the wilderness that had become their home. Inside, their family slept safely, generations bound together by love and blood and choice. The house Samuel had built with his own hands stood solid around them, a testament to their commitment and hard work. "Josephine," Samuel said after a while, his voice soft in the darkness. "Yes? If I could go back to that day when I found you struggling with damp kindling, knowing everything I know now, I would not change a single thing." She turned to look up at him, seeing the truth of his words in his eyes. "Not even the tough venison?" He laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "Especially not the tough venison. That venison brought us together in the most important way. Because you proposed over it, because we laughed about it, because we found joy in imperfection. Because it taught us from the very beginning that life does not have to be perfect to be wonderful. It just has to be seasoned right." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. After 30 years, he could still make her cry with his simple, profound observations. "I love you, Samuel Quinton. I have loved you from that first night, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you," he said, pulling her close. "My brave, stubborn, wonderful wife who crossed half a continent alone and changed my life forever." They kissed then, slow and sweet and full of the comfort that comes from decades of knowing someone completely. When they finally pulled apart, Josephine sighed contentedly. "We should go to bed," she said. "Morning comes early." "It does," Samuel agreed. "But let me hold you a little longer. Let me be grateful for one more day with you." So they stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other in the wilderness and built a love that would last generations. Behind them, their house held their family, their past and their present. Before them, the mountains stood eternal, and the future stretched out full of promise. The venison had been tough, but the seasoning had been perfect, and a mountain man had asked his lady to marry him mid-chew. From that imperfect, beautiful moment had grown a life beyond either of their imagining. A life of love and laughter, of children and grandchildren, of hard work and deep satisfaction. A life that proved that the best love stories do not need perfect moments or ideal circumstances. They just need two people willing to choose each other, day after day, through tough times and tender times until the very end. And as Samuel and Josephine finally went inside to bed, walking hand in hand through the home they had built together, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious. They had found their perfect match, their true partner, their soulmate. Not because everything had been easy, but because they had made the hard things beautiful. Not because life had been perfect, but because they had seasoned it just right, together, always together. And that made all the difference.